with these dual crises weighing on the country, the pandemic, the protests, we have assembled a very special panel this evening to be with us for the hour. Jay Clayton, the chairman of the SEC, Darren Walker, head of the Ford Foundation, Gary Cohn, former economic advisor to the president, and Dr. Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening as we try to wrestle and make some sense of what often seems like a senseless moment in our country. Darren, I want to start with you this evening. You just heard what the president had to say. Inequality is a large part of this conversation taking place in America as we are seeing unrest. The COVID problem is another that we are trying to contend with, and we're trying to do it all at the same time. If you could just offer some words for us in terms of how you see it and what needs to be done now. If we do anything over the next hour, I hope we can try to come up with some solutions together.
Andrew, there are reasons for hope. And I believe that if this nation takes seriously the challenge of inequality, dismantling it, deconstructing it, we can once again be a society where opportunity is our hallmark. But we have lost opportunity and hope as the signature features of our society, in part because we have an economic system and a form of capitalism that is no longer delivering our ideas of shared prosperity. That is the aspiration and the opportunity of capitalism. As a passionate capitalist, I want the system to work, but it has to work for more people, and it has in the past. Unfortunately, we have designed a form of capitalism today. It's no accident. We have made choices, our leaders in the economy, our leaders in corporate America, our policymakers have made choices that have preferenced and privileged some of us. So it's made choices to grow and amplify assets while making it harder for some Americans and workers to gain access to assets. I'll give you one example. My grandfather, who had a third grade education, grew up in the segregated South. He went to work as a porter at a company in Texas in the 1950s. That company had an employee profit sharing plan. Even though he was a low-wage worker, he got ownership in that company. He retired and lived for 20 years off of the proceeds of that stock in that profit-sharing company. What happened to those programs that allowed workers to share in the assets of a company as they grew? We made choices to allocate the bounty, the profits, to fewer people who did not include our workers. And in the process, we have created a system whereby workers and working class people feel more alienated from their employers, the companies that employ them, because they more often than not themselves are no longer owners in that company. That's just one example of what we need to do and what we can do if we're to have a kind of economy that generates more shared prosperity.
Thank you, Darren. Let me go to Gary. Gary, I give you an enormous amount of credit because for the last several weeks you've been talking about COVID, but interestingly, you've been talking about it in the context of the inequality that it's creating and about so many of the essential workers in this country that have been on the front lines, while so many others that might be very well part of the 1%, including folks like us who are coming on this air on Zoom, have been able to be protected. And I just want you to speak to the need to reopen, which is an issue we're all trying to contend with, but how we can do that in a fair and just way, given these inequalities that we're all wrestling with.
Well, thanks, Andrew. Look, since the end of March, I've been trying to point out, I think what's the obvious is that as we decided what businesses were essential and what business was non-essential, we ended up maybe intentionally or maybe by accident, making the largest businesses in America essential. The large box retails, the big companies essential. And we took all the small local businesses, the minority-owned businesses, the family-owned businesses, the family-run businesses, and we said, you're not essential, and you have to shut down. And we allowed the bigger businesses to thrive. At the exact same time, we sent the small businesses home. I thought at the time this was wrong because you could buy the exact same goods at the Target or the Walmart or the Kmart as you could at my local shop that was closed. Yes, they sold food and they sold drugs, but they also sold clothes and shoes and other goods. And I thought that this was inequality, and I thought we would have a problem because people wanted to go to work and they wanted to earn a living and they wanted to feed their families, and they were unable to do that. And now we're at the point where I think, and Dr. Gottlieb will help us on this, I think we're at a point where we can try and get the small businesses open, but they're going to have to fight for the market share that they lost to the big companies that were allowed to stay open the whole time.
I think Heidi Heitkamp is now with us. And Heidi, I don't know if you've been able to join us and if you were able to hear earlier President Trump speaking about and really doubling down on this idea of law and order amid this unrest and these protests across the country. We're also talking about how do you reopen? And there's a real question going on here, which is how do you reopen? How do you make people feel comfortable in this country? And it's now not just feeling comfortable about and having confidence in your own health, but it's also having confidence that there is going to be law and order in the streets, but also a sense of justice in the streets. Where do you land? What should happen here?
Andrew, it's so interesting because right off the bat, the president has the law wrong. He can't call out the military to do law enforcement official. There's a law called the Posse Comitatus law. And instead of standing up and saying, I hear you, these are the things what we're going to do, but we have to maintain law and order. We have to do the right thing by the communities that are peacefully protesting in these businesses who really deserve a fair shot of reopening, but it's not going to happen if they're looted and destroyed. You know, it's interesting. One thing he could have said is, guess what? I know that almost 95% of all African-American businesses who applied for PPP, for the loan program, didn't qualify. That's wrong. We're going to fix that. We're going to give you a greater opportunity. He could have come with about 5 economic suggestions, including education equality. Instead, he's trying to not fund state and local government, the vast majority of which goes to educating people. And so he just sends the wrong message. And the message should be inclusive. I hear you. I'm not going to violate the law, Posse Comitatus law, but we need law and order. Can you help me establish that? And we can work together. But you never hear that from the president.
Jay Clayton, help us with this. I think part of the conundrum that the public is grappling with is the issue that the stock market, which we talk about on this air and this network so often, is basically as high as it's been since this virus took hold, and even on a day when in a week where we've had so much unrest, there is still, at least within the investor community, optimism, but that optimism translates to wealth among those who have access to it, and so many others who don't, who look at that and say there's something wrong here, there's a disconnect. What do you tell them as somebody who oversees the markets in this country?
Hey, Andrew, good evening, and it's good to hear from my friends who preceded me. Look, it's a good question, Andrew. The stock market, and this is. I'm not going to talk about valuations. It's not what we do at the SEC. But what it does is it's a reflection of a number of people's views of where companies will be, these publicly listed companies will be in the future. Gary can speak to this. I can speak to this. We're talking about where earnings for these companies are going to be in the future. And the market sentiment these days, whether you look at the stock market, the bond market or otherwise, is that we're going to have an economic recovery. That's what the market sentiment is telling us today.
Well, let me ask, talking about the market sentiment and this sense that there's going to be some kind of V-shaped recovery, let me go to Dr. Scott Gottlieb. There's a big question, and maybe Gary and others and Darren can jump in here as well. But there's a real question mark about how quickly the country reopens, whether we have enough testing in place, whether we have enough tracing in place, all of these things to make employees, especially those at the lowest income wages, feel comfortable and confident that their health is going to be in order. And we've even talked about whether we should offer bonuses to try to incentivize people to come back to work. Some people think that's a great idea. There's other people on the other end who say they're called kamikaze bonuses. What do you think is the right answer to get this country back in order from a health perspective?
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. I think from a public health perspective, we're going to be able to successfully make a staged reopening of the country over the next several months. I think that there's going to be a seasonal effect here as we get into the summer, and I think we'll be able to restart economic activity and relax the restrictions that have been in place and successfully reopen. I think the risk is really to the fall that we're going to have a level of infection in this country continuing to spread through the summer, albeit at low levels. That sets up the risk of wider spread in the fall. But going into the summer, we should be able to pull this off successfully. The question is, does the consumer come back? Do people have confidence to re-engage in activities in the same way they did previously? And the answer to that may be that they don't, that for a period of time, people don't do things that they did before and they do things differently. And we can't get back to 100% right away. We have to do things differently and really define a new normal about how we go about our activities.
Doctor, though, but here's the question. How much of us getting back to work this summer is I don't know if this is magical thinking, because it seems to be thus far working, but it's not based on the testing and the tracing that folks in the healthcare community like you have advocated for so long. It's not based on that. At least it doesn't seem to be at the moment. Am I wrong?
Well, I think the testing's going to be in place, I think, and especially as we look to the fall. We're testing about 500,000 people a day. It's robust. It's growing. I think the platforms to do the testing are going to be ample as we head into the fall because of new technologies that are going to be coming onto the market. The issue is going to be access to testing. The testing's not going to be at the sites and in the communities that it needs to be. It's going to be harder to get tested for COVID than it should be. And we're not going to be doing enough to turn over asymptomatic and mildly symptomatic cases. And so we need to get testing into places like work settings where people are at risk of infection because they can't socially distance at work, into housing environments where people are in more crowded housing environments, and that's a risk for spread of COVID, into communities that lack access to health care. And this gets to some of the disparities that are leading to a disproportionate impact of COVID on certain communities. So it's not an issue of the testing itself, but access to testing. And as far as tracing is concerned, yeah, you see different states doing different things. We don't have a national coordinated strategy to that. And some states are doing a good job, and others aren't investing as much as they should be in those strategies.